It begins in silence, not the silence of an empty room, nor the silence between words, but the deep, absolute quiet that exists beyond sound itself. A quiet so total that it swallows not only your voice, but the very memory of having ever spoken. Out there, at the edges of the known universe, light itself struggles to move. There are no dawns, no twilights, only an unending night that has been here since before the first stars were born. And it is here in this cold and ancient dark that something happened, something that should not have been possible. NASA did not expect it. No one did. On a routine sweep of deep space radio frequencies, their instruments caught a pulse, so faint, so distorted by gravitational warping, that at first it seemed to be nothing but noise. Static from the cosmic background radiation, a phantom in the signal. But when the data was pulled apart, layer by layer, frequency by frequency, it began to resolve into a pattern. And patterns, in the language of the universe, are never accidents. You've heard that nothing can escape a black hole. That once you cross the event horizon, you are lost forever. Matter, light, time itself pulled down into a place where the rules of reality no longer apply. Hawking radiation, gravitational lensing, accretion disks. These are the words we use to dress the mystery in the language of science. But in truth, we do not know what lies inside. We only know what we cannot see. And yet, here it was, something that had crossed the uncrossable boundary. A signal. What does it mean when the impossible happens? Do we rewrite our understanding of physics? Or do we question our own perception of truth? The signal repeated every 41 seconds. It was not a perfect repetition. Each pulse came with slight variations in amplitude, tiny shifts in phase, as though it was being filtered through something alive. Some on the team joked about it, called it the heartbeat of the void. But there was something unnerving about it, something that did not feel random. The data analysts grew quiet in their work. They stopped making eye contact. And then one night, in the middle of a graveyard shift at the listening array, one of them froze at her console. She'd run the pulse through a spectrogram, and there, buried deep in the harmonics, was a shape. Not a star, not a galaxy, not a natural formation. It looked deliberate. When you stare at a black hole through a telescope, you're not seeing the thing itself. You're seeing the violence it creates around it. The light of stars stretched and smeared into arcs. The gas in its accretion disk heated until it glows with the energy of a million suns, the shadows bending in ways that make your eyes feel wrong in your skull. But the center, the singularity, is always hidden. And yet, this pulse carried information from inside. They didn't say that publicly, of course. The official line was that it was interference, equipment noise, a false reading caused by solar flare activity. But privately, the engineers began comparing notes. The signal had been detected on multiple arrays, on multiple continents, all locked to the same coordinates. The heart of a supermassive black hole in a galaxy 400 million light years away.
What was sending it?
Some imagined alien civilizations trapped in the crushing gravity well. Others wondered if it was a natural phenomenon, some unknown interaction of matter and energy at relativistic speeds. But there was a smaller, quieter group who began to suspect something far stranger. They noticed that the time intervals between the pulses, when charted, formed ratios that matched known orbital resonances in our own solar system. And hidden in those ratios were numbers. Prime numbers. As if the signal was counting. Counting what? Down to what? When you look at the night sky, you are looking at the past. Every star is a time capsule. Every photon a traveler that has crossed years, centuries, millennia to reach your eyes. But what if the message you receive is not just from the past, but from a place where time does not move in the way you understand it? A place where the past, present, and future are all trapped together, endlessly circling, like the debris in a whirlpool that never ends. The deeper NASA dug, the stranger it became. Running the signal backward produced an eerie mirror image, a second pattern hidden within the first, as if the message was meant to be read in both directions. And when they layered the two together, a wave of cold passed through the room. The combined signal formed a sound. Low, resonant, almost human. Like a voice speaking from the bottom of a vast, echoing cavern. No words, not yet. Just the cadence of speech. The rhythm of something trying to speak. Days later, a preliminary analysis was drafted. It was labeled classified, internal review only. It spoke cautiously of non-random modulation and possible coherent source within gravitational boundary. It did not use the word intelligent, but those who read it felt it between the lines. And then, without explanation, the report disappeared from network. The files were locked, the backups purged. The analysts were reassigned to unrelated projects. A quiet memo went out. Cease all work on anomalous detection ID #EHR 317B. But you cannot erase something once it has been heard. The signal kept echoing in their minds. Some of them, restless, unable to let it go, saved fragments of the data on private drives. They ran their own tests, late at night, at home, on laptops in dark rooms where only the glow of the screen lit their faces. And what they found made the hair on the back of their necks rise. The signal was not just a sequence of pulses. It contained a carrier wave, one that, when stripped away from the noise, produced an interference pattern unlike anything they'd seen. It wasn't static. It wasn't random. It was an image. Faint, distorted, but unmistakable. A curve, a horizon, and against it, a shape like a doorway, narrow at the top, wider at the base, as though some impossible structure stood silhouetted against the darkness inside the black hole. How could there be a structure inside? Who or what had built it? Black holes are not places in the conventional sense. They are boundaries in space-time. Once you pass the event horizon, all paths lead inward. Gravity is so intense that even light cannot find an escape route. To speak of inside is to step into a realm where the geometry of reality collapses into something we cannot visualize. And yet, there it was, a doorway, a suggestion that the black hole was not simply a prison, but perhaps a passage. The human mind is not built for such implications. We evolved to read faces in the firelight, to follow the seasons, to navigate by landmarks and stars. But what happens when the landmark is not a mountain or a tree, but a tear in the fabric of reality itself? What happens when something beyond that tear looks back? There is a moment in every mystery where the air seems to grow heavier, the colors sharper, the ordinary sounds distant and muted. A moment when you realize that whatever you have found is not just strange, it is dangerous. That moment had arrived for the people who had touched the signal. And somewhere, in the quiet corridors of NASA, the decision had been made. The world was not ready to know. But secrets are restless things. They move, they leak. And as fragments of the data began to circulate among those who refused to look away, a new question arose, one that no one wanted to answer aloud. What if the black hole wasn't speaking to everyone? What if it was speaking to someone in particular? It is a strange thing, the way information disappears. Not in the way a leaf falls and is carried off by the wind, or the way a footprint slowly erodes under the tide. No, this disappearance is deliberate, surgical, an erasure so precise that it leaves no gaps, no smudges, nothing to suggest that anything was ever there at all. The report was gone. Every copy, every backup. Officially, it had never existed. But among the few who had read it, the memory lingered like an afterimage burned onto the retina. They could still see the lines of text, the charts, the waveform diagrams, the coordinates in bold type at the top of page 3. Coordinates that pointed directly to the center of the black hole. Coordinates no one was supposed to have. When the order came down to destroy the files, some obeyed without hesitation. Others hesitated. You could see it in their posture, in the way they looked at the floor instead of the supervisor's eyes, in the way their fingers lingered on the keyboard just a moment too long. And then, in the quiet hours of the night, some of them broke the rules. They copied slivers of data. A graph here, a fragment of the waveform there, just enough to prove to themselves, if to no one else, that they had not imagined it. There is something intoxicating about forbidden knowledge. It changes you subtly at first. The world seems different, thinner, as if the everyday reality you once trusted is only a thin film stretched over something older and far stranger. Every shadow feels like a question. Every silence feels like a space where an answer should be. The fragments began to circulate in whispers. A USB drive slipped from one palm to another in the corner of a cafe. An encrypted email sent from a library computer. Late-night phone calls that ended with the words, "Delete this after you hear it." And in these fragments, in the messy patchwork of stolen data, something began to emerge, something the official report had only hinted at. It wasn't just that the signal was structured. It was that the structure contained a second layer. The main pulse was like a heartbeat, steady, repeating, relentless. But beneath it, buried in modulations too faint to notice without advanced filtering, there was another pattern. Slower, more deliberate. It was as if someone, or something, had hidden a message inside the message. And when the analysts stripped away the top layer, they found something they could not easily explain. The hidden pattern was a set of frequency spikes spaced in a very specific way. When plotted on a graph, they formed not a curve or a scatter of points, but something that looked almost like a map. The scales didn't make sense at first. Light years compressed into millimeters, seconds stretched into centuries. But the longer they looked, the more they began to see familiar shapes. Star clusters, gas clouds, paths between them. And then came the first real shock. The map didn't point to somewhere out there. It pointed here. Not Earth exactly, but the solar system itself. The map's endpoint was locked onto our sun. And from there, to a point in space just outside the orbit of Jupiter. Why? Jupiter is massive. Its gravity dominates the solar system beyond the asteroid belt. It has no solid surface, no life as we know it. But it does have moons. Dozens of them. Some with ice-covered oceans deep below their frozen crusts. Some capable, at least in theory, of harboring life. Was the black hole's signal pointing us to one of them? Or was it pointing to something else entirely? The implications pressed like a weight on the chest. If this was a map, it meant the signal was meant to be followed. But how could something trapped inside a black hole know where we are, know the exact position of our star and our planets? That knowledge would require either impossible observation or a vantage point outside time itself. One of the physicists who had held on to a fragment put it plainly in a midnight email to a colleague. "I think we are looking at instructions, but I also think they are old. Very old. The signal may have been sent long before humans existed." Which raises the question, who was it meant for? Not long after, the first of the leakers vanished from the discussion groups. No more emails, no more quiet calls. His apartment was found empty, rent paid up for 6 months, personal items gone. A neighbor swore they saw him leave one night with 2 men in dark suits, but no security cameras had recorded anything. The others took the hint. The chatter grew sparse. Encryption keys were changed. The fragments stopped moving from one hand to another. And yet, in the way these things always do, the knowledge had already spread too far. Once an idea takes root in enough minds, it becomes almost impossible to kill. Even if the data itself is destroyed, the memory of it survives, shifting, mutating, retold over coffee and in dimly lit bars until it is half myth, half truth. Among the surviving fragments was one that showed something remarkable, an animated reconstruction of the black hole's signal over time. The pulses were rendered as arcs of light on a black background, and with each cycle, the arcs shifted slightly, like the sweep of a radar arm moving across an invisible horizon. And then, after hundreds of cycles, the arcs began to align into a new shape. A circle, but not just any circle. This one was slightly irregular, bulging on one side, pinched on the other, like the distortion of a gravitational lens. To the trained eye, it was instantly recognizable. The warping effect you would see if you were looking at something massive through the curvature of space-time. Inside that circle was a smear of brightness. Too blurred to resolve, too alien to name. Some thought it was a star. Others thought it was something else entirely, something that did not belong in our universe. One thing was certain, the smear was moving. and its movement was in perfect synchrony with the hidden heartbeat inside the signal. Whatever it was alive, and that changed everything. Because if something alive was inside the black hole, sending us maps, sending us signals, then the boundaries we thought were absolute, the event horizon, the speed of light, the arrow of time, were not boundaries at all. They were doors. But doors open both ways. What would happen if this door opened toward us? At first, the coordinates didn't seem extraordinary. A sequence of numbers, a set of celestial angles, just the kind of thing you'd expect in astronomy data. They were precise, yes, down to an accuracy far beyond what any known natural signal should produce, but not impossible. Not on their own. What made them impossible was when the astrophysicists ran the conversion. The coordinates didn't point to a random patch of deep space. They locked, unerringly, to a star system 4,000 light-years away. A system cataloged long ago, marked unremarkable, with no known planets, no unusual emissions. A system so ordinary it had been ignored for decades. But here it was again, glowing at the center of the black hole's hidden map. For most of the team, the immediate question was simple. Why would a signal from inside a black hole point us there? But one of the researchers, an orbital mechanics specialist with a habit of seeing things others missed, noticed something the others had overlooked. When the coordinates were plotted over time, over the full recorded cycles of the signal, they shifted. Not much, just fractions of an arcsecond, but enough to matter. Enough to suggest that the target wasn't fixed in space. It was moving. Everything in the galaxy moves, of course. Stars orbit their galactic center. Systems drift. But this was different. When he accounted for the movement of the black hole itself and the gravitational distortions of the intervening mass, he found that the target's motion wasn't consistent with any ordinary stellar drift. It followed an arc, and that arc traced backward into a place not in our space at all. It traced into time. We measure the universe by light, by how far it's traveled, by how long it has taken to reach us. But light is only a witness to time, not a master of it. And if you could step outside the normal flow, if you could perch at some impossible vantage beyond the horizon of causality, then past and future would lose their meaning. You could see not only where something is, but where it was millions or billions of years ago, and perhaps where it will be. The numbers from the black hole didn't just indicate a point in space. They indicated a point in history, billions of years in the past, when the target star burned hotter and younger, when its surroundings were not empty at all, but crowded with other suns and debris and something else. The astrophysicist showed his calculations to two colleagues in a quiet corner of the lab. Neither of them spoke for a long time after reading them. And then one of them, an older man who had spent his career studying the relativistic mechanics of black holes, said softly, "If this is right, then it's not a message to us. It's a message to someone who lived before us, before humans, before Earth." The idea took hold like frost spreading over glass. If the signal was targeting a point billions of years in the past, then whoever, or whatever, sent it might not have been trying to reach us at all. We were only eavesdropping on something older than our species, older than our planet, perhaps older than our sun. But that realization came with another, more unsettling thought. If the message was not meant for us, then how had we intercepted it? And if we could hear it now, did that mean someone else in some other era had heard it too? In the weeks that followed, fragments of the data were fed into deep analysis software. AI models combed through the pulse structure, searching for repeating sequences, harmonics, patterns in the variations between cycles. What they found made no sense unless you abandoned one of the most basic assumptions of physics. The signal did not seem to be traveling forward through time in the way all other signals do. Buried in its modulation was a ghostly inversion, information that appeared to be arriving from the future, interfering with the past. When plotted, the two flows overlapped, creating shapes that were symmetrical not in space, but in time. It was as though the black hole was not just a point of no return, but a kind of bridge, with one end anchored in the far past and the other in a far future that to us has not yet happened. And somewhere along that bridge, something was speaking. The AI's results grew stranger still. It began to generate predictive sequences. Not extrapolations, not guesses, but strings of data that matched future pulses in the signal before they were even received. The system was, in effect, reading ahead in the conversation. This should have been impossible. And yet, the predictions were always right. No one could explain it. No one wanted to try. Some of the analysts refused to work on the data anymore, claiming headaches, insomnia, dreams filled with strange imagery. A few of them spoke of hearing the pulse outside of work, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the hum of appliances, in the rhythm of their own heartbeat. There are certain moments in science when discovery and dread arrive hand in hand, when you understand something new about the universe and wish, instantly, that you didn't. This was one of them, because the deeper they went into the signal, the more it seemed to be watching them back. One night, a junior analyst running a phase shift comparison noticed something so subtle it almost escaped her attention. Between two cycles of the pulse, in a tiny gap of near silence, there was an extra sound, a faint, rising tone, like the intake of a breath before speech. She amplified it, ran it through filters, slowed it down. It didn't sound like interference. It sounded intentional, organic, and when she played it back at normal speed, it was gone, as if it had been hiding in the recording, waiting for her to find it. The next day, she tried to replicate the result, but the data had changed. The gap was still there, but the rising tone was gone, replaced by something else. Something even stranger. A single, sharp sound, like a knock. And for the first time, the question shifted. It wasn't just, what is the signal trying to tell us? It was, does it know we're listening? The knock was not supposed to be there. In the language of deep space signals, every sound, every spike, every trough should be explainable. Radio emissions obey physics. Pulsars rotate, quasars flare, background noise hums with the ancient static of creation itself. But this was not cosmic background. It was not equipment error. It was sharp, deliberate. And in that instant, a room full of trained scientists felt something they had no word for, something beyond curiosity, beyond fear. They felt noticed. The knock was not repeated in the next cycle, but when they ran the earlier data through a different set of filters, time reversed, phase inverted, something emerged that no one had expected. The signal worked both ways. When played forward, it was a pulse, measured, patterned, always changing slightly from cycle to cycle. But when played backward, the pattern didn't dissolve into noise. It rearranged itself into another coherent structure, similar, but inverted, like a reflection in water. And just like a reflection, it wasn't identical. Details shifted. Shapes that were vague in one direction sharpened in the other, while others blurred away. It was as if the signal had been designed to be read from both ends of time. One of the theoretical physicists on the project proposed a model late at night, after too much coffee and too little sleep. He drew it on the whiteboard in a cramped, windowless office, a bridge with two ends, each anchored in a different temporal direction. On one end, a civilization in the deep past, sending a message forward. On the other, something or someone in the deep future, sending a message backward. And in the middle, balanced on the knife edge of a black hole's event horizon, the two messages overlapped, merged, became one. It would mean the black hole was not merely a prison for matter and light. It was a meeting point, a place where the laws of time broke just enough to let two impossible voices touch. But if that was true, then what exactly were they hearing now? The voice of the past? The voice of the future? Or something born in the interference between them? They began layering the forward and backward signals together. The result was haunting, a slow, undulating rhythm that rose and fell like breath. Not mechanical, not purely random. Alive, and buried deep in the harmonic structure was something that made every person in the lab stop what they were doing. Words. At first they were fractured, like shards of glass scattered on a floor. Snatches of syllables, incomplete consonants, vowels drawn out into long, wavering tones. But with every layer of noise removed, they came closer to coherence. The words were not in English or any known human language. but there was a cadence to them, a syntax that made them feel disturbingly familiar, like overhearing conversation in another room and realizing that, somehow, you understand the emotion behind it even if you don't know the vocabulary. The linguists who were quietly brought into the project described the structure as self-referential. Phrases echoed themselves in reverse, looping back into earlier parts of the signal. Some sentences seemed to end before they began. Others began twice, diverging like branches before rejoining again. It was speech caught in a mirror maze of time. But there was something else, a subtle, unnerving detail. When the linguists constructed a timeline of the phrases, they discovered that the reversed phrases didn't just mirror the forward ones. They inverted their meaning. If the forward signal expressed attraction, the backward signal expressed repulsion. If the forward one described creation, the backward one described destruction. As though two voices, one from each in a time, were arguing. In the middle of this strange dialogue was a repeating sequence, always the same length, always bracketed by the same two tones. This, they realized, was the core of the message, the part that both directions agreed on. When they translated the mathematical structure into visual form, the result was a kind of diagram, concentric curves, spirals within spirals, like the cross-section of a seashell. And at the center of the shell was a small, perfect void. They didn't know why, but everyone who looked at that diagram felt the same thing, a pull, as if their eyes wanted to fall into it, as if the image was not just a representation of something, but a doorway to it. More troubling still, the sequence began to appear where it didn't belong. One of the analysts was riding the subway home when she saw it scratched into the metal of a train door. Another noticed in graffiti on a wall near the lab. A third found it drawn in the margin of a decades-old physics paper, written long before the signal was ever detected. It was as if the pattern had been leaking into the world for years, maybe longer, waiting for the moment to be recognized. When they fed the pattern back into the AI, it responded in a way no one could have anticipated. The system didn't just analyze the input, it changed its own processing cycles to match the rhythm of the diagram. The usual green activity lights on its casing began to blink in perfect sync with the heartbeat of the signal. And then it generated an output file without being asked. The file was a spectrogram. The spectrogram was an image. And the image was of them, not a metaphorical them, not a symbol. A literal, high-resolution image of the control room where they were working, down to the layout of the consoles, the mugs on the desks, the posture of the scientists themselves. But the colors were wrong. The edges were distorted, as if viewed through some immense gravitational lens. And there was one more detail impossible to miss. In the image, the room was empty. No people, no movement, just the machines running in the dark. No one spoke for a long time. Finally, someone whispered the question no one wanted to ask. Is this a picture of now or of later? That night, the project lead locked the lab, disabled all remote access, and called a closed meeting. In that meeting, a decision was made. No further analysis of the reverse signal. No more layering forward and backward together. The risk, they said, was too great. But risk, in the presence of something like this, is a relative term. The data still existed. The image still existed. And curiosity, once ignited, is not easily extinguished. So a handful of them kept going in secret. And it was in those hidden hours, with only the hum of the machines for company, that one of them finally asked the question that had been building since the knock. What if the signal isn't just talking to us in both directions of time? What if it's teaching us how to talk back? It is one thing to suspect, another to see. Suspicion lives in the mind. A private storm, a thought you can set aside when the lights are bright. But seeing is an intrusion. Seeing is when the idea steps across the threshold into your world, pulls out a chair, and sits across from you without asking. And once it's there, you realize it has always been there, waiting for you to notice. The image was no longer a smear. It had teeth now, edges. The light bent around it in ways that matched the equations, yet felt wrong to the eyes. Wrong in the same way a dream is wrong. Familiar shapes behaving in impossible ways. Inside the warped halo of the photon, ring stood a form. Not a statue. Not a random play of shadows. A presence. They enhanced cautiously. The halo brightened into a crisp arc, compressed on one side by the relativistic spin of the black hole, stretched thin on the other like molten glass, pulled under tension. Inside, the figures sharpened in layers, each pass through the algorithm peeling away another veil. First came the outline. Vertical, narrow, upright despite the gravity that should have turned any matter into a smear of radiation. Then the proportions: a head, shoulders, arms. Then a hand, 5 fingers, slightly spread. It was not waving, not beckoning, just held there, as if to say stop, or wait, or remember. The first to speak was the youngest on the team, a postdoc whose job until now had been to clean noise from the signal. She said, very quietly, "It's human." No one corrected her. No one told her to be cautious, to remember pareidolia, to recall that the mind hungers for faces. They all saw it too. One of them, the image processing lead, suggested an experiment. If the figure was an artifact of their reconstruction methods, changing the method should destroy it. So they built 3 separate pipelines, each using entirely different assumptions about the black hole's mass, spin, and orientation. They used different priors, different deconvolution strategies, even different data fragments. The figure persisted. The pose changed slightly between reconstructions, as if it had shifted between moments. But the proportions were the same. The hand was always there. And then, the detail that made the room fall silent. In one reconstruction, the head tilted. It was subtle, a fraction of a degree, the kind of shift you'd dismiss as noise if not for the fact that it was in the same direction across multiple frames. As if the figure had acknowledged something. As if it knew it was being watched. For hours, no one left the lab. The outside world was reduced to the hum of equipment, the low buzz of air conditioning, the clicking of keyboards. They cross-referenced every known distortion effect that could produce such an image. Gravitational lensing anomalies, data folding from phase noise, algorithmic hallucination. Nothing fit all the parameters. The image refused to break under scrutiny. That night, one of the team, a senior astrophysicist who had worked with NASA for 20 years, pulled out a folder from her desk. Inside was a photograph, printed on glossy paper, slightly faded at the edges. It was a portrait of a man, smiling faintly, wearing the Navy flight suit of an astronaut. His name was known only to those who had read certain sealed mission reports. Missions labeled unrecoverable, mission loss, incident classified. She laid the photograph beside the screen. The room leaned in. No one said it aloud at first, but they all saw it. The curve of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the length of the arms. Not perfect, gravity distorts. Light lies, but enough. Too much. It made no sense. The man in the photograph had been declared lost decades ago, when a classified mission to study a captured micro-black hole fragment ended in a catastrophic systems failure. Officially, he had never returned. His capsule had been vaporized. His body had never been found. And yet, here he was, or something that wore his shape. Theories bloomed and withered in the same breath. Some said the black hole was a mirror, reflecting an old image back to them through time. Some said it was a trap, holding fragments of whatever fell into it, playing them back like relics. Some whispered that maybe, impossibly, he was still alive, held in a place where time had no forward arrow, where the decades since his disappearance had never passed. The hand in the image became an obsession. Was it a signal? A warning? A recognition? One analyst rotated the frame until the hand's orientation matched a vector pointing directly out of the black hole's axis of rotation. Plotted on the sky, that vector intersected a narrow region far beyond our galaxy, and directly aligned with the ancient coordinates hidden in the signal from the start. It was as though the figure was pointing, not to the observers, not to itself, but to somewhere else. They argued late into the night. Was it an instruction? A plea for rescue? A trap? The idea of rescue felt like madness. No known physics allowed for retrieval from beyond the event horizon. And yet, the signal existed. The image existed. Impossible things were already happening. Sleep became optional. Meals forgotten. They began to dream in pulses, in arcs of light bending toward the same impossible form. One team member, the same postdoc who had first called it human, reported a recurring dream in which she stood on a black shore, looking up at the photon ring as if it were a rising sun. In the dream, the figure stepped closer each time, the hand lowering slowly. She would wake before it reached her. Meanwhile, the image processing specialist made a final adjustment to her algorithm, one that would push the resolution to its theoretical limit. The risk was high. Too much enhancement could fabricate detail, create patterns that weren't there. But the hunger to see outweighed caution. The render took hours. The lab stayed lit through the night. When the final frame appeared, there was no mistaking it. The face was clearer, still distorted, still smeared by the lens of space-time, but unmistakably human. Eyes like dim stars. A mouth not speaking, but almost. And there, just barely visible at the corner of the mouth, a curve. Not fear, not pain, a smile. It was the kind of smile that makes your stomach tighten, because you can't tell if it's meant to comfort you or warn you. The name was buried in a folder no one was supposed to open. It lived in a language of lost missions, dates without press releases, launches without returns. In the quiet archives of NASA's darker years, there are pages stamped with long strings of classification codes, where the margins carry notes written in hands that no one admits to knowing. And among them, there was his photograph. He had been a test pilot first, then an astronaut. The kind who carried the look of men who have spent too much time with speed and altitude, a stillness in the way they stand, an easy patience in the way they wait for the next danger. He had been selected for a mission that almost no one outside a narrow circle even knew existed, to study up close something the agency had only recently captured. Something not from deep space, but from here, a micro-black hole fragment trapped in the gravity well of Earth. The story, as it was told in the few corridors where it could be told at all, was that the fragment was the relic of some long-dead star, pulled in by the solar system's drifting arm through the galaxy. It was small enough to study, large enough to terrify, and because it was already decaying, bleeding, hawking radiation into the void, someone in a position of power decided it was safe enough to approach, to look, to touch, in the language of engineers. His mission was to rendezvous with it, deploy instruments, record data, and return. He did the first two. The third came in fragments. The fourth never happened. The official record says catastrophic systems failure. It says loss of signal. It says mission terminated. There are no photographs of the wreckage, no coordinates of the debris field, only the quiet understanding among those who worked the mission that he went too close, that he crossed a line no one had drawn because no one believed it could be crossed. And now, decades later, his face, or something wearing his face, was looking back from inside a black hole 400 million light-years away. They tried to explain it in the language of science. Perhaps it was coincidence, they said. Faces are patterns, and patterns are everywhere if you look hard enough. But the match was too close, the pose too deliberate. Others said maybe it wasn't him, but a recording of him, a fragment of light, of data, stolen at the moment of his fall and somehow preserved in the singularity's strange memory. But memory requires a medium. What medium could exist in a place where time is not a straight line, but a circle collapsing on itself? A darker thought crept in. What if he was still alive? Not alive in the way we understand it, with heartbeats and breath, but alive as information, as a pattern sustained by the black hole's geometry. A consciousness without a body. A witness trapped on the edge of forever. They dug deeper into his history. Friends remembered a man who could be both quiet and ferociously alive, who could hold a silence like it was a form of communication. In his flight logs, there were small notes, one-liners about the feeling of being above the world, the hum of the cockpit, the way the stars looked when you're moving too fast for them to look back. One log, dated 3 weeks before the mission, ended with a single sentence. I think there are places we're not supposed to see. What had he seen? And why, after all this time, was his image appearing now? The figure in the black hole did not act like an echo. An echo repeats without change. But in frame after frame, the posture shifted, a degree here, a fraction there, as though acknowledging the observers, as though aware of their growing fixation. Sometimes the hand lowered slightly, only to return in the next cycle. Once, the tether they had seen in Segment 4's reconstructions seemed to slacken, as if whatever held him was loosening or tightening. It was impossible to tell. The signal itself began to change. The pulses, once perfectly spaced, began to arrive with small irregularities. At first, they seemed random, but a careful analysis revealed they formed a second sequence, faint, hidden beneath the primary rhythm. When decoded, the sequence mapped onto a series of time intervals that corresponded exactly to the launch and lost dates of his mission. It was not coincidence. It was a reminder. Some of the team began to talk about rescue. The idea was absurd. Nothing escapes a black hole. And yet here was proof that something could come out. Light, information, an image that should not exist. If information could leave, could a person? Could he? Others were less hopeful. They whispered that the black hole was not offering him to them. It was showing him as bait. That the tether was not a lifeline, but a lure. That whatever intelligence shaped the signal understood human longing far too well. The debate split the lab. One side argued for following the coordinates, sending a probe toward the point in the signal's hidden map. The other side warned that following was exactly what it wanted. They invoked the oldest of navigational superstitions. Never answer a call from something you don't understand. The arguments bled into the night, into the dreams of those who stayed. Several reported waking in the dark with the feeling of being observed, as if someone were standing at the foot of the bed. One woke to find his bedroom clock frozen at the exact timestamp of one of the signal's anomalies, the second hand trembling in place. When it moved again, it skipped 3 seconds. In the lab, the image processing specialist made a personal decision. She would push the resolution further, regardless of protocol, regardless of what the agency might do to her if they found out. She ran the reconstruction again, layer by layer, until the face was almost clear enough to mistake for a high-resolution photograph. The smile was still there, but this time the eyes had changed. They were no longer fixed on the camera's imagined position. They were angled slightly downward, as if looking at something just out of the frame. When she adjusted the crop, she saw it. A faint outline, too faint to be sure, of a second figure standing behind him. It was taller, and it was not human. The second figure was wrong in ways the human eye struggles to catalog. It was not monstrous, not in the crude sense of teeth and claws, but in the deeper sense of geometry that doesn't fit, of proportions that shouldn't exist outside of nightmare or mathematics. Tall, yes, but not merely elongated. It was as though the body had been assembled from the memory of a human form, remembered imperfectly by something that had never seen one in light. The outline shifted depending on how you looked at it. Sometimes narrow, sometimes impossibly broad, like a shadow moving across uneven ground. No details emerged. Only an impression of surfaces that reflected nothing, absorbing light in a way that even the surrounding darkness could not. It was the absence of light, sculpted into a shape. No one spoke for a long time. When someone finally did, it was in a voice that sounded older than it had an hour before. Maybe it's not behind him. Maybe it's in a different part of time. It was an absurd thing to say in any other room. But here, in a lab that had been listening to an impossible signal from inside a black hole, nothing was absurd anymore. The physicists began running new models. The black hole was spinning. That much had been confirmed early. And when a black hole spins, it drags space-time around with it, creating an ergosphere, a region outside the event horizon where nothing can remain still, where even light is forced to move in the direction of the spin. Inside that storm, energy can be extracted, matter can be flung outward, and, in theory, strange paths through time can open. If the figure, the astronaut, was somehow trapped in that region, then the second presence might not be near him in space at all. It could be near him in time, a looped neighbor, inhabiting a different fold of the same moment, the way two reflections can occupy the same mirror without touching. They began to suspect that the black hole wasn't simply a singularity. Its interior geometry was wrong. Wrong in the same way the signal was wrong. The data from the accretion disk showed light bending in patterns inconsistent with Einstein's predictions. Gravitational lensing mapped in arcs that hinted at structures, not physical objects, but shapes in the curvature of space-time itself, like the frozen ripples of a wave that had broken on an invisible shore. One theorist, the one who had first described the two-way signal, put the idea on the board: closed time-like curves, loops in time, pathways where an object could travel forward only to arrive in its own past. Inside such loops, an event could cause itself. Information could be sent to its own origin. The past could speak to the future without crossing the space between. If that was true, the astronaut might not be alone. The second figure might be another traveler, or another version of himself, shifted along the loop. Or worse, it might be something that lives entirely within the loop, never entering or leaving, aware of all times within it the way we are aware of all points in a room. And if that was true, then the signal might not be a rescue at all. It might be a lure. The thought hollowed the room. For days, they worked in a kind of silence that made every keystroke sound like an intrusion. The models grew more complex, simulating not just the black hole's spin and mass, but the interactions of photons within the looped space-time inside it. In some runs, the signal was a byproduct, a side effect of light trapped in orbit, leaking fragments outward like a lighthouse with a cracked lens. In others, the signal was intentional, shaped by something using the loops as a kind of machinery. The AI models returned strange results. When trained only on the forward time data, they produced predictions that matched the actual signal with unnerving precision. When trained only on the backward time data, they produced predictions that matched events inside the lab. Door openings, power fluctuations, the times people entered and left. Coincidence, perhaps, but enough of them began to notice small synchronicities that sleep became rare, meals forgotten. Then came the experiment that changed the way they thought about everything. They injected a false signal into the analysis pipeline, a pattern of pulses designed to be obvious nonsense. They want to see how the real signal would interact with it, if at all. For 3 cycles, nothing changed. Then, in the 4th cycle, the nonsense vanished, replaced by a perfect inversion of itself, buried in the signal's modulation. As if the black hole had answered. The message was simple. It had heard them. No one wanted to run the test again. But curiosity, that ancient, reckless survival flaw, overcame fear. They sent another false signal, this time one patterned on a question, a binary encoded query that translated loosely into "Who are you?" The response took longer, 7 cycles, but it came. Not words, not even a language. An image. It was the tether. The same tether they had seen in the earlier reconstructions. Now sharper, clearer, extending not just into the darkness, but through it, emerging into a field of stars that did not match any known sky. Star charts were pulled, databases combed. The sky in the image matched a configuration that hadn't existed for billions of years. A sky from the deep past, which meant the tether was not anchored to the present. It was anchored to history. One of the senior physicists sat back in his chair and said, "We've been thinking of it as a prisoner. Maybe it's a bridge." The room stayed quiet, but something in the air changed. The possibility was too large to hold all at once. If the tether was a bridge, if the astronaut was a fixed point between 2 different times, then the second figure might be guarding it, or waiting for someone to cross. And then came the thought that no one wanted to voice. If the tether is a bridge, it works in both directions. That night, one of the junior analysts, alone in the lab, was reviewing the latest frame. The astronaut stood, as always, hand partly raised. The second figure loomed just behind, its shape less stable than before, edges fraying like smoke. And then, for the first time, she saw movement. The astronaut's head turned fully toward the shadow. The shadow leaned closer, and the feed cut to static. It began quietly, the way most invasions do. Not with alarms, not with any clean moment of recognition, but with the smallest fracture in the ordinary. Someone forgetting the layout of their own apartment for a heartbeat. A word that feels foreign in the mouth, though it has been spoken every day for years. The taste of a food you've never eaten, sharp and clear as if you'd just taken a bite. The first to notice was the linguist. She had been mapping the forward and backward phrases of the signal, hunting for their points of symmetry, when she suddenly understood a sequence she knew she had never learned. Not just the sound of it, the meaning. It was not a translation. It was as if she had remembered a word from a language she had once spoken fluently, a language she had never heard before in her life. Others began to report the same. The image processing lead dreamed of a coastline under a black sky, where the tide was made of light that came in slow, deliberate pulses. A systems engineer caught herself sketching a symbol she did not recognize, only to find it matched one buried deep in the modulation of the signal. The postdoc woke one morning certain she had been walking through a city with no ground, its buildings suspended on invisible threads, its streets open to the vacuum between stars. The experiences were not shared in the usual way. No one wanted to admit that the work was bleeding into their minds. But slowly, the similarities emerged. Certain symbols, certain landscapes, a sky with a dark, swollen sun, water that did not reflect, shadows that moved independently of the objects that cast them. The human brain is a pattern-making machine, but it is also a fortress. We tell ourselves that memory is ours alone, the private ledger of our time on Earth. But this was not memory as recollection. This was memory as intrusion. They were not recalling events they had lived through. They were recalling events that did not belong to them at all. The psychologist brought in to quietly observe the team, a move that itself was never officially acknowledged, took notes in a hand that trembled more each day. She recognized the symptoms, though the cause was unprecedented. Intrusive imagery, false familiarity, dissociation. But here, these are not the aftermath of trauma. They were the result of exposure to information, to a pattern, as if the signal was not only carrying data, but embedding it in the neural architecture of those who decoded it. She proposed, in a report that no one outside the lab would ever read, that the black hole's message was not a message in the human sense. It was an imprint, a structure meant to seed itself in the mind of the receiver, not to be read but to be lived. And then came the strangest detail of all. Some of the memories began to repeat. They called them loops. A team member would have a dream or a waking flash of walking down a corridor lined with glass panels. A few days later, another member would report the same scene, down to the angle of the light, the faint hum in the air, the sensation of being watched from behind the glass. They tested for cross-contamination, for the possibility that one person's description had planted the idea in another's mind. But in every case, the memory arrived before the description was shared. In one loop, they stood on a plain of black stone under a sky with no stars. In another, they floated in a chamber of rippling liquid, breathing without lungs. In a third, they watched the tether stretch away into the dark, not from the lab's reconstructions, but from the astronauts' own point of view. The black hole's warped horizon towering above like a vertical ocean. The memories were vivid in ways that dreams rarely are. You could feel the grain of the stone under your fingertips, taste the metallic tang of the air, hear the creak of a structure flexing under invisible forces. And with each experience came the same undercurrent. You were not alone. One night, the linguist stayed late, running a loop through a new semantic mapping algorithm. She felt the now familiar pull behind her eyes, the moment when the signal seemed to step closer, to look at her instead of through her. This time, the scene was different. She stood in a long, narrow room lined with tall, curved windows. Outside was the halo of the black hole, brighter and larger than it had ever been in the reconstructions. At the far end of the room stood the astronaut, facing away. The second figure was closer now, its edges shivering as if it were made of something unstable. Between them was a small, black object hovering in the air. She reached toward it. The scene broke. The next morning, she told no one. But the black object haunted her, a perfect absence, as if her mind had been asked to imagine a shape and been given only the hole where it should be. The intrusion began to affect waking life. The systems engineer reached for his coffee mug one morning and realized, halfway through the motion, that he had expected it to be in a different place, the place where it had been in one of the loops. The image processing lead walked to the window during a break and found herself momentarily surprised that the sky was blue, not black. The postdoc froze in the middle of a sentence during a call home, unable to remember whether the person on the other end had ever existed outside of her memory. And still, they kept working, because if they stopped, the memories would remain unanswered questions. And unanswered questions are a kind of hunger. Then, during a routine playback, the signal changed. The primary pulse slowed, not by much, but enough that the pattern of the loops shifted. The harmonics deepened, and in that deepening came something new, a voice. Not speech in any language they knew, but a cadence, a rhythm, the rise and fall of something meant to be understood, even if the words themselves were impossible. The linguist listened to it for hours. She began to hum it without realizing. Others found themselves tapping their fingers in time with it, breathing in time with it. The psychologist warned that the signal was entraining them, aligning their internal rhythms to its own. If that was true, then every moment they listened was another step toward becoming compatible. Compatible with what? No one could answer. But that night, 4 of them, without planning it, without speaking, dreamed the same dream. They were standing on the threshold of a vast doorway of light inside the black hole. The tether extended from somewhere behind them into the doorway. And in the light stood the astronaut, smiling, hand extended. The second figure was gone. They called it the quiet room. The name was unofficial, passed along in whispers by those who worked deep enough in the agency to know that some rooms have no labels on their doors. It was not listed on any building map. If you asked about it directly, you would be told that no such place existed. And yet, if you stood in a certain corridor of the Johnson Space Center, you could feel it, a coldness behind the wall, the kind of absence that is not simply the absence of sound, but the absence of permission. It was here, they said, that the unedited signal was kept, not the fragments that leaked into the hands of restless analysts, not the filtered versions run through public-facing instruments. The full stream, unbroken from the moment it was first captured. No cleaning, no reduction, no safety net. No one outside the small, sealed list of authorized personnel had ever heard the complete recording. Those who did were changed. You could see it in their posture when they walked out, a slight forward tilt as though carrying something heavy in their chest. Some did not return to their old projects. Some retired quietly. One never spoke again. The lab team had known about the quiet room in the way you know about the deep ocean, as a fact remote and abstract. But after the latest change in the signal, the slowing, the voice-like cadence, whispers began to circulate that the room had been reopened, that someone inside was listening right now. The linguist was the first to suggest it out loud. What if the rest of the signal is nothing like the part we've been working on? No one wanted to think about that. The fragments had already done enough. The impossible image, the tether, the memories that were not theirs. What would it mean to hear everything, unfiltered? One of the senior physicists, the kind who had spent decades walking the line between classified work and public science, leaned back his chair and said quietly, "If they're keeping it in there, it's because they think the rest of us can't handle it." But curiosity is a solvent. Once poured, it eats through walls. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived in the linguist's locker. No return address, no handwriting, only a key card and a note with a single word: midnight. She did not tell the others. She told herself she was protecting them. The truth was simpler. She wanted to be the one to know. The quiet room was not large. Concrete walls, a single table, 2 chairs. In the center, a console the size of a suitcase, its surface crowded with dials and switches that looked decades older than the building itself. On the wall, a set of headphones hung from a hook like a stethoscope in a clinic. There was no light except for the faint green of the monitor. She sat. She put on the headphones. At first, it was exactly what she expected. The heartbeat of the black hole, the same pulse she had lived with for months, unbroken now, no gaps between fragments. But as she listened, the pattern shifted. The backward and forward components merged until she could no longer tell which way time was flowing. The hum thickened, became layered, like the sound of an ocean heard from deep below. And then the images began. Not visions in the metaphorical sense, but literal images behind her eyes, as if the signal were a frequency tuned not only to the ears, but to the architecture of memory itself. She saw the tether, stretching not through space, but through an infinite lattice of moments, each shimmering like beads on a string. She saw the astronaut, not as a still figure, but moving, turning, stepping forward, the hand lowering as if to welcome her. And she saw the second figure, not looming now, but close. Its edges were sharp, its proportions clearer. It did not resemble any human shape, and yet there was something in its stance, an attentiveness, that made her think it understood her presence. The cadence of the signal deepened, and she realized it was not just sound. It was breathing, the inhale and exhale of something vast enough to hold centuries in a single breath. The images accelerated. A city floating in the void, oceans without a horizon, a sky with no sun, only a vertical ribbon of light that pulsed in time with the signal. Faces she didn't know, faces that looked at her as if they had been waiting. Symbols burned into the surfaces of structures that bent and folded like paper in a child's hands. And over it all, the constant pull toward the doorway of light inside the black hole. She took the headphones off. The room was silent. Her heart was not. When she left the quiet room, she did not tell the others what she had heard or seen. But in the days that followed, they noticed changes. She began speaking in clipped phrases, as if translating thoughts too large to fit into sentences. She stopped using certain words altogether. Sometimes she would pause in the middle of a task, her gaze fixed on a point in the air, and smile faintly, as if hearing a joke no one else could. Then, without warning, she was gone. Her apartment empty, her email silent. The keycard was found in the lab, lying on her desk, the word midnight scrawled in the corner of a notebook. In her absence, the rest of the team began to notice something unnerving. The signal had changed again. The cadence now matched her voice. It began like any other day in the lab, except for the feeling that something was about to end. No one said aloud, but they moved more quietly, their gestures slower, as if trying not to disturb something fragile. The monitors glowed in the dim light. The pulse of the black hole, the heartbeat they all knew too well, rolled through the speakers. Regular, relentless, almost comforting, and then it stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence in the room. Oh wait, for a moment, no one breathed. The absence of the signal was worse than its most unnerving distortions. The absence meant change. The systems engineer's console was the first to flicker. A new file appeared in the incoming data queue. No label, no timestamp. Just a single string of characters, 000-001. The kind of naming you'd expect from the very first transmission in a new sequence. They opened it. The audio began with static. Not the wide, random hiss of cosmic noise, but something narrower, focused. It grew sharper, deeper, resolving into the low, measured tone of the black hole's pulse, but slowed, stretched until each beat was a wave that seemed to move through the body itself. And then came the voice. It was not a human voice. Not exactly. But it spoke in a rhythm that made you feel it could have been if it had wanted to. The syllables bent in ways no vocal cords could shape, resonating with overtones that seemed to brush against parts of the mind never meant to be touched. The linguist, had she still been there, might have called it a statement. The psychologist might have called it an instruction. The rest of them just listened. When the first image arrived, it was not through the usual spectrogram decoding. It bloomed directly into the center of the frame. The doorway of light, clearer than ever before. The tether stretched into it from the foreground, and in the light stood the astronaut, both hands visible now, both reaching forward. And he was smiling. Behind him, just at the threshold, the second figure stood still, edges no longer shifting. Its form was waiting. The tether pulsed once, a ripple that ran from the foreground into the doorway, vanishing into the brightness. On the monitors, the light in the doorway flared, and for an instant the lab's instruments went blind. When the image cleared, the astronaut was closer, almost at the point where the tether met the unseen camera. His expression was unchanged, but his eyes were locked directly on the viewer, as if looking at each of them in turn. The voice returned. This time it spoke a single sequence, repeated 3 times. Binary analysts decoded it within minutes. It said, "Do not follow." The warning hit harder than an invitation would have. It carried the weight of something that had seen what lay beyond and wanted, or needed, to keep others away. But the image betrayed the words. The hands extended forward. The smile was not the smile of refusal. The room divided instantly. Some said the warning was real, that the signal's purpose was to end here. Others said the words were a test, a filter to see who would ignore them. And a few, the ones who had felt the loops and the dreams most vividly, said nothing at all. They had already decided. The AI, left to process the signal in the background, produced one final output. An image. A star field. Not our current sky, but a map. It traced a path from Earth to a point thousands of light years away. The same point the hidden coordinates had always indicated. The same place the tether, the gaze, and the subtle gestures had been pointing to all along. And then, the file changed. It did not overwrite itself in the normal way. The pixels shifted slowly, as if being replaced from the inside out. The star field dimmed. The map unraveled. And in its place came a single image, the control room of the lab. Empty. Dark. The chairs pushed back from the consoles. The monitors off. No sign of the people who had been there moments ago. No one moved. The image lingered on the screen until the monitors powered themselves down. That night, the systems engineer went home and found a small envelope on his doorstep. Inside was a photograph of the astronaut, the same faint smile, the same outstretched hand. But in the background, just visible over his shoulder, was the engineer himself, standing in the doorway of light. The envelope had no return address. In the days that followed, the signal did not return. The black hole was still there, still spinning, still bending the light of distant stars into impossible arcs. But the heartbeat was gone. Only the normal hiss of a universe remained. Officially, the project was shut down. The data locked away. Unofficially, fragments of the final transmission began to surface. A spectrogram here, a compressed audio clip there. Each one incomplete, as if the signal itself had decided how much of itself could be seen. And in each fragment, if you looked closely enough, you could see it, the doorway, the light, and a figure standing on the threshold. Sometimes the astronaut, sometimes someone else, sometimes yourself. If this was the last thing it wanted us to see, no one could agree on what it meant. Was it an invitation? A warning? A reflection? But one truth settled in quietly, unshakable. Whatever waits inside that light has already been here.